if you take the same mass of sulfate and spread it out over more area, you're going to get more ozone loss. The ozone loss figures are having distributed, we can distribute copies of the paper soon. But now we're going to get to results. So to me, a core, really thinking, as like an engineer here, thinking about trade-offs. So the axes that we're thinking about are ozone loss, forward scattering, and stratospheric heating. I'll just show you the trade-off here between the global ozone column loss and the radiant forcing. I should say the numbers I'm going to show you for ozone loss are very exaggerated for two reasons. One is our model has a short-lived growing species that quite a few early models don't have, and that makes all else equal the ozone loss a little bit bigger. And we're using today's, or never preference exactly days, but more or less current chlorine loadings. And that exaggerates how much loss you get for a given amount of sulfate, because presumably we're not actually going to do any of this sort of erosion for many decades, and at that point the chlorine loadings are down, so the response is down. So I'm showing you the very worst case here, which is with current chlorine loadings. So I mean, what the idea would like is to be able to reduce gradient forcing to some number, whatever it is, which may be 0, and to have no ozone loss, or actually we'd like to be restoring ozone towards pre-industrial. We've been thinking a lot about that, and we think there are plausible ways to do it. But here's sort of what the trade-off curves, if you like, look like for the regular SO2 that's been looked at for many, many cases for this Pierce-et-al scheme where we make a finer particle size distribution by using issue SO4. So here's it with 80 nanometer alumina, which is absolutely terrible. It destroys ozone fantastically. It's useless, upgraded with scattering. And here it is for 160 and for 240. What you're seeing here is a lot of things pulled together. This is simply the de-scattering. This is reflecting how much agglomeration there is into the higher order aggregates. And the bottom line is that say, alumina, to choose one example, there's not that much difference in these high index solids really. We have about half the ozone loss for the same rate of forcing as we do with sulfates. There's lots of uncertainties. That gives you a sense of why we're after this. So looking across all these measures now, for ozone loss, we can get something like half or even a little bit better than half. And as I said, there may be ways to do substantially better than that still, but that's kind of where we are with thinking now. For diffuse light scattered, there's a really large reduction. So from sort of 18 or 16 watts forward through down scattering to something less than a half of that or a third of that. And to give you a sense of comparison, the peak down scattering during the tubo would have been 30 plus watts per square meter, up to 48 peaks. So when people are concerned or casually say that solar erosion will change the color of the sky a lot, I think the answer is you certainly could do it that way. But if you did a moderate amount of solar erosion using a more high index solid, you wouldn't remotely be doing that because these changes are much, much smaller than a tubo change, and that had a pretty small impact in that regard. And then the other was stratospheric heating. So these are actually heating rate calculations from RRTM, the rate transfer code that John Magnet is running. What we haven't done is do now a dynamic model to actually calculate the temperature change, but you can sort of scale. So the heating rates that we have are similar to the heating rates Ferrero that all had, that produce kind of a couple K heating at the tropical tropos. And couple K heating tropical tropos is a big deal for stratospheric temperature differential heating index. So the fact that we get much, much lower heating rates is really a similarly big deal. So bottom line is that potentially, and this is just scratching the surface, some of these solid aerosols might actually be able to produce the same rate of forcing with less of some of the side effects that are of concern. Of course, they may have other side effects that are worse. This is just the beginning, from my point of view, of looking at this in a serious way, but it's a start. So I would say a few words about experiments, just kind of to allow conversations to get going. Several of us, Tom Ackerman is in the room, and our group and others, we need to think really seriously about how we would design small field experiments. There are papers available, as I'll show on our website, but the one we're working is called the stratospheric controlled perturbation experiment, and the idea is to basically make a small amount, small we can do, and have it be evenly mixed and be able to re-enter it several times during one diurnal cycle. A small chunk of stratospheric air, and This gives you sort of a sense of what the, actually not the current experimental science, it's moving rapidly, but the key thing is the stratospheric science community has for a long time used aircraft. In aircraft, you get lots of sound, you get very long flight, and you can look at the covariance of a bunch of the chemical parameters of the stratosphere, and that's taught us a huge amount about the curve of the stratosphere. But once you start thinking what you want is a small perturbation that you want to see it, for at least today, because all these ozone chemistry is driven by radicals, and those radicals depend on solar zenith angles. So basically, one day's observations tell you the enormous amount of what you need to know about the stratospheric chemistry. Then you really want to be back to a balloon, which drifts passively with the perturbed air mass. And the perturbed air mass is pretty small. Well, it's big if you think about volume, kind of cubic kilometers where we think we are. But in terms of material, that says a kilogram, but I think we're actually down to 100 grams or so, so a small handful of sulfate, which is about equivalent of 1 minute of a commercial aircraft looks like. This gives you a sense of what instruments and so on look like. And this is part of the other, there was 2 companion papers published in the recent Phil Tran's issue, and this is from the companion one that looked at a whole suite of experiments, including the one that Tom Ackerman are developing. The point is simply that there are a range of experiments that people with a track record of doing atmospheric science are thinking on, and these experiments can teach us something useful about things that would inform what the risks of solar geoengineering might be, and do so with perturbations that are objectively very small compared to other activities. So now I want to change gears completely. That was kind of new work. Hopefully some of this actually was completely new, only a week old. And now I want to change to some more thinking about scenarios for implementation and what their consequences might be. So Dr. Martin and I have put this together in a paper that tries to argue that not that this is an optimal scenario, but the scenario that's mostly been used, that's kind of formed the basis of most analysis, is that we double or quadruple CO2 and then we bring temperatures back to the feed industry. And that's sort of the implicit basis of lots of analysis. And we think that's a pretty poor basis because it's extremely unlikely that that is sort of a sensible use of geoengineering. Not to say there's any correct unitary way where you could do analysis and find the right or optimal answer. I don't believe that. So the basic part of it is less hideous and suboptimal. So we think it's important that it's temporary in the sense that the endpoint is solar, the endpoint is zero. When you think about doing this over a couple centuries, people say, how can we do anything over centuries? Well, centuries are actually things where we have had experience maintaining systems like the global electric power grids or transatlantic telecommunications. We've maintained things like that for more than a century through world wars, not all perfectly, but humanity actually does know how to do things like that. They're responsive and they're moderate. Let me just say what I mean by moderate, because that's crucial. Again, a very large amount of the research here has been driven around this assumption that you compensate away all temperature changes. So I think it's extremely unlikely that that is anything like the optimal. So if you think of what the benefits are of solar geoengineering, is you turn up the amount of solar geoengineering. They rise for a while. The benefits are in terms of reduced climate change on a region-by-region basis. They'll go up for a while, they'll saturate, and they'll shortly go down. In fact, they go way down, and if you really went all the way down to like 8% or 10% reduction of sunlight for a century, you would freeze the oceans to the equator. Nobody's talking about doing that, which gives you a sense that you wouldn't want to do this too much. How much time do I have? I started at the clock. Yeah. You started quite late. I have 13 minutes, according if I had 30.
Yeah, we did start late.
Okay. Damages grow non-linearly, and there's lots of different ways that might happen, but in general, the assumption is damages grow non-linearly, and most of the research that's been done is assume that we do it at peak benefits. And economics 101, that's nuts. Much more likely you want to do it at a place where you maximize the ratio of benefits to costs. So somewhere in there. And you've got papers and so on. This, where are we here? And that's a paper that says all this that's available on my website. So then last couple slides. Think about sort of the next couple centuries scenario for how we might implement. So this is some idea of what business as usual might be if we worked extremely hard. You heard a really nice talk from David Kai yesterday about how hard extremely hard forward is we might be able to bring emissions down to zero towards the end of this century. And so thinking about that, this is in terms of emissions in gigatons a year. If you think about that in terms of climate risk or rate of forcing, this is what BAU might look like now. It's a dirty secret of climate policy analysis that the person who controls BAU controls the agenda. So BAU is a kind of collective hallucination. Nobody knows what this mythical business as usual is. We can say something about, what would happen if we started late to bring emissions to zero, or what would happen if we started earlier to bring emissions to zero. But the point is if your only tool in your toolbox is cutting emissions, then the only thing you do is lose more slowly. You stop making the problem worse. And I think there's some profound ways in which it's hard to get people really motivated to spend a great deal of money to just stop making the problem worse. So with solar regime sharing, you can of course think of scenarios where you do it for a while and ramp it back down. Even if you do know carbon removal, this still has a benefit. Folks like Ray here are completely right. This doesn't do anything to reduce climate change in 2200, but it does slow things down, and lots of climate impacts have to do with the rate. So there's a benefit to slowing things down alone. But let's think a little bigger than that. So if you have some kind of wedge of conservation, energy efficiency, or even carbon removal just is a way to get us efficiently to zero net emissions. And of course, we have to do that in the long run to deal with climate risk. Then you have some amount of carbon removal you do to actually pull emissions back down. And I think there's no doubt we can do carbon removal. There are lots of ways to do it at costs that are plausible. The issue, it's a thing that's hard to do if you want to make sudden changes over decades, but if you want to do this over a couple centuries, it's something that is pretty small compared to the cost of rapid mitigation. And then you do solar geoengineering and some combined strategy. And I think that something like this doesn't solve the climate problem. There's no solution to a problem as complex and multidimensional as climate. But it gets us to something that looks a lot more like a restoration of some of the pre-industrial climate on a timescale of human lifetime or two. And I think that's something that could really motivate many people to put more effort into the whole problem, which includes emissions cutting, than we do now. So, as you know, despite the fact that many people working on this are thinking hard about how we might minimize environmental impacts, despite the fact that there is lots of evidence that these technologies could substantially mitigate environmental impacts for some of the most vulnerable people and ecosystems. These are the kind of views that get commonly expressed. And I want to pick particularly on views inside the scientific community. And as many of you know, at the end of the recent National Academy report process, Ray Humber, who's a very thoughtful, impressive, and respected geoscientist, wrote a little op-ed that said this. And I want to take the time to push back. So I think we need to have a more civil dialogue in the climate science community. So Ray is saying here, Ray's maybe completely right that it's wrong to do these technologies, and he should explain why. But notice the matter. And so Ray's implying here that this is pretty much a direct reference to the work that Doug and I and others have done, trying to argue that it should be one of these slow-moving temporary scenarios. And Ray is saying that they're mainly shot by albedo modification boosters. That would be me. It's a less threatening way to get the camel's nose under the tent, which I guess is assuming that the real goal here is just to do a huge amount of geoengineering because it's really fun, and we're spying up with all the stuff that we say about maybe we want to actually minimize risks. And that's a pretty ugly thing to say. And I think that we need a dialogue that gets beyond that whole ugliness, that gets to serious debate about the sensible reasons that are to do nothing, to not do these technologies, which I think there are sensible positions, but this is not one of them. And gets at realistic debates about how well these things work and don't work, but gets away from this kind of personal opinion. Thank you.
Simon Taylor, University of Edinburgh. So you put forward a scenario in which geoengineering is a temporary thing while you do carbon capture and drawdown. one issue is where are you going to put it? If we imagine that part of the wages for is likely to be carbon capture and storage, it turns out that known places where you can store are less than the amount of the reserved fossil fuels. Resources are significantly less than the resources of fossil fuel. I worry that there may not be sensible places to store the gigatons necessary.
So I worked on that topic for 10 years, but I don't work on it now. I could be that big. But certainly what you're saying was not the consensus of the IPCC special report. It is not the consensus of much of the work I know on this. If you assume that you can use sediment aquifers, and even more, if you assume that you can stir them by accelerating a dissolution by pumping, which is completely conventional oil field technology you could buy today, then at least the numbers that I've seen from many papers suggest that the potential volumes go into the many 10,000 gigaton class. So I mean, the answer is if you're right, then we shouldn't think about it. But I don't believe you're right. But I'm happy to give you new information on where. Good.
Hi, David. One of the sort of things that seems to be emerging from some of the work that has been done in the UK and some of the work in Germany is that solar radiation management actually seems to be the most efficient way of doing carbon dioxide removal. I wonder whether you wanted to give me your opinion on that, because I think it's actually quite interesting. These things can't be, they don't necessarily have to be taken as an entirely separate entity.
Yeah, I mean, if you did SRM so as to hold temperatures constant, which I don't think is likely a sensible thing to do, you effectively hold in CO2 that otherwise would have come out because of warming, and that means that you get an added sort of 100 gigatons or more per century, which is actually not that big compared to total emissions, but it's still like all of US emissions for the whole century. It's not negligible either. So, yeah, it's true that it's relevant.
Hi, I'm Renaud Leroux from the University of Montpellier. Have you had a look at the effects of titanium dioxide doped with nitrates that produce ozone?
Yeah, so the reason that we didn't use TiO2 is because of concerns that we have about the band gap of TiO2 makes for photocatalysis. And so we haven't thought about it so much because of that. But Andrew Davison has told me that in fact TiO2 manufacturers routinely make coatings, and that's easy. And he knows his stuff, so I'm sure that's correct. And at this point, we're really just kind of testing out the model we haven't. I should have said that. The particles we chose are in no way optimal. They're more like our first steps now that we've got the darn model working. We're actually thinking a lot about different particles and about doing some laboratory chemical tests on particles, including on this issue of photooxidation. So I wouldn't rule in or rule out TiO2. It seems to me you want to look for things that are all else equal, that are earth abundant, and that are reasonably regular toxicity. And one of the things that I like about aluminum, one of the reasons we looked at it, is there actually is a long history of detailed study about the atmospheric chemical consequences of alumina, because it's in space shuttle on the edge and exhaust, and NASA funded a bunch of studies back to the fact that Deborah was even offered a study on the stress effects of alumina 20 years ago.
Hi, Keith. We've seen recently in one of Susan Solomon's papers that there's been a number of injections of material from volcanoes in the Calypso satellite. And so instead of trying to go through this controversy of putting material into the stratosphere so that you can sample it Lagrangian, then perhaps you could you have something in the package ready for when there's another volcanic blast.
I think that's separately important, and I and others have been working on that, but it actually really doesn't do the same thing. So for one thing, we want to sample what maybe in some layers, the first thing we add is actually not sulfate, but water vapor. And we want to probe stratospheric chemistry in high water vapor conditions. And so it actually isn't easy to do that in the natural stratosphere, even with a volcanic perturbation. So I think there are very good reasons for us to learn how to do controlled experiments. And you might think the better question is why not do them in the lab? Well, that's an answer to that. But I think just looking at volcanoes really doesn't get at some of the core chemistry wants.
So along that lines, David, does your model look at the amount of water vapor that goes into forming sulfate aerosols? Because that's going to dehydrate the stratosphere.
Let's talk about one. I'm trying to understand the question. I mean, the water mass that goes into the sulfate, that's essentially yes.
It's relatively small.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're talking about a couple of orders of magnitude. One last question, please.
Hi, there are two issues that occur to me with the.
Could you give your background to you?
Yes, Andrew Goldman, I'm a geology engineering group. The two issues that occur to me from the changes that you're potentially suggesting is that firstly that the change in the ratio of the back scattering and forward scattering can potentially make a big difference in net primary productivity because the increasing scatter bias seems to do quite a lot for plant growth.
Why don't you stop right there? Because we're tight. That's a good question. So the answer is, if my goal, I mean, geoengineering, people have different goals, right? And if the goal is to maximize primary productivity, then you hire me to maximize primary productivity. I would actually want to make sure we had a higher CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and I would use the that did a lot more scattering. And that would almost certainly increase the primary productivity of the planet. There's nothing inherently wrong about that goal, but it's not my goal. My goal is to reduce environmental impacts.
Can we thank David at this point, please? Right, we're running about 5 minutes behind schedule, but can I introduce Duncan McLaren. Duncan, after a degree in geography and business management, joined the Friends of the Earth and was there for some years. He's now at Lancaster, but he advises the research councils on energy and climate change.
Thanks very much, Peter. Oh, that's right, the land, isn't it? Today I'm going to say a little bit about what understanding technology as socially embedded and ethically loaded might mean for SRM science, and how ethics might actually evolve to try and handle what I think is a paradigmatic Anthropocene technology. So we've just had lots of science, Dan a bit of it, so I'm going to start with some science fiction. And this, of course, is not a new insight. It reflects long-established political understanding. Voltaire apparently said it first. Lincoln, in a similar vein, said, if you want to test a man's character, give him power. Well, why is that? Because power brings capability and choice to affect many lives, for good or ill. And power also, as we all know, corrupts. So society develops ethics programs, accountability mechanisms to counterbalance that effect. In the case of climate change, the world's elites hold power over the poor and vulnerable, now and in the future. As societies, we've done very little to build mechanisms of ethics and accountability for that sort of collective power at international and intergenerational scales. Here in the global north, we still struggle to understand our complicity that arises from the benefits we obtain from unjust global systems. Rather than changing our behaviours and reducing our consumption, we seek novel abatement technologies and adaptation measures as substitutions for mitigation. In this light, everything we do, all discussion of geoengineering, can be seen as a sign of our collective ethical failure to achieve adequate climate mitigation. Yet the power that shapes our choices there remains concentrated. SRM geoengineering appears to offer the potential of more rapid, perhaps even more targeted control over future climates. Because of its great leverage, it threatens to concentrate power even further. In this respect, it resembles nuclear weapons. It's no coincidence, I think, that radionuclides from atomic tests are one suggested way of demarcating the Anthropocene, the age of humans. But I'd argue that SRM is the archetypical Anthropocene technology, offering both destructive potential and the prospect of management, or even, as David ended up saying, the capacity to restore the planet's climate to something more hospitable to human civilization. But deployed as climate restoration, SRM would be effectively determining the living conditions of all humanity. This great power brings great responsibility and difficult ethical questions. Now, the movie Snowpiercer portrayed that sort of Anthropocene. In the movie, a failed geoengineering experiment plunges the Earth into an ice age, reducing the human race to a few passengers on one train, their lives entirely conditioned by a tiny elite, the driver in his global cockpit. In the movie, freedoms are curtailed, hierarchy steepened, people are exploited as ends, as a means to an end, quite literally so. Small children are used to keep the aging engine running. But the ordinary passengers rebel. They wreck the train and choose instead to take their chances adapting to the changed climate of the new Earth. Now, it's a stark illustration of how environmental and technological change can reshape our ethical landscapes and the choices we face. In real life, too, technologies of planetary control will change our relationship to the Earth, redefine what it means to be human. Historically, even the wealthiest and most powerful have remained vulnerable to natural disasters like hurricanes. If such forces are instead controllable and controlled, our roles and our responsibilities are transformed. If we have the capability to prevent the extremes of climate change, by what authority do scientists and governments choose to deploy it, or not? How do democratic institutions engage? If interventions cause harm, how will the perpetrators be held responsible? If a preventable event causes harm, who is liable? We've already seen foreshocks of this with court battles in Italy over the potential liability of seismologists for earthquake forecasting. How much sharper would such battles become if the topic was not just advice or forecasts, but deliberate and active interventions in the climate? In this context, ethics and science cannot be disentangled. Yet many physical scientists choose to maintain a pose of objective detachment, separating their science from their day-to-day ethics and morals. I saw that when I talked about 5 years ago at the sandpit where the SPICE project was born. My call there for embedded ethicists in research groups went unheard and largely unremembered. But perceptions were already changing by the time of the stage gate in June 2011 when I sat on that. And overall, I think researchers in SPICE have learned the hard way that psychology, culture, politics, ethics, and moral values are critical to good geoengineering science. I hope that's one of the reasons I've been asked to speak today. In hindsight, though, the SPICE project always reminds me of the spice melange from Frank Herbert's classic science fiction book, Dune. The spice is the most powerful technology of its time. It's used by mutated humans to enable safe space travel, to the extent that he who controls the spice controls the universe. The tale turns on the temptations of such power, the Pandora's box opened by seeking control over the spice, and the virtue of the hero who resists temptation, instead destroying stocks of the spice and leading a struggle for freedom against the corrupt power of the empire. In the real world SPICE project, by contrast, the balloon test bed was seen initially as a fairly mundane matter, incremental engineering, model building, verification. But to the wider world, I think it appeared more like a SPICE, an assertion of control over nature, with an all-powerful technology, one that would redefine humanity, taking a symbolic step out of the laboratory, challenging the nascent moratorium on field research in geoengineering. The researchers found themselves in a political and media battleground where, rather like the Emperor's troops on June, they were unprepared and on unfamiliar ground. Although the public knew little of the technology in question, that media debate and the public engagement studies undertaken around the project revealed that the public could still put the technology in a meaningful, real-life context. And this holds today. The public understand that just because scientists, and I was looking for David there, just because scientists work on SRM as a response to climate change to manage the risks, that alone does not ensure that it will be deployed ethically in the interests of climate justice. The public perceive the cultural, economic and commercial interests at play. They resist the prospect that geoengineering technologies might be developed and deployed in the interests of the same corporate interests that have driven fossil fuel use. And they worry that such interests could distort genuine scientific endeavour. So for SPICE, this came to a head in the issue of intellectual property, with the revelation of prior patent interests that had not been adequately considered at the project development stage. So in both fiction and reality, SPICE reveals technologies interacting with our values, changing behaviours, changing ethical landscapes. But geoengineering is not unique in this respect. All technologies, from guns to seatbelts, form part of socio-technical systems. They affect people psychologically and culturally in ways that can produce perverse results. Notably, they can reshape how we perceive and react to risk. For example, people buy guns to protect themselves, yet controlled epidemiological studies show that those who carry firearms are more than 4 times more likely to be shot than those who do not. Carrying a weapon apparently stimulates confidence. Believing themselves somehow insured, gun users take much greater risks and get into more dangerous situations that they would have avoided if unarmed. SRM, I think, shares some interesting characteristics with guns. We appear to need it because we've collectively failed to prevent a major risk to society. Actors who have it may well argue against risk prevention, as they feel both personally safer and see the technology as protecting important lifestyle, social or market freedoms and rights. Moreover, its use could become locked in, or both become locked in and lock in other choices which increase risk. With widespread gun ownership, the gun lobby becomes a powerful actor against gun control. The police must be routinely armed. Poor black men tend to meet the fatal consequences. With a climate policy reliant on SRM, the termination problem makes stopping extremely challenging in the absence of effective decarbonisation, while the technology could enable the fossil fuel lobby to promote continued extraction and use of fossil fuels, despite this also having unfairly distributed impacts. In other words, there could be serious moral hazard associated with the technology. Now, the crux of David's presentation, I think, was that SRM can and must complement mitigation and CDR. So it is crucial that we work out whether there is a moral hazard that would reduce mitigation and CDR. The term moral hazard originated where insurers were concerned that people of weak moral character would take advantage of insurance by being careless or even fraudulent. more recent definitions focus more narrowly on the tendency of people to adjust their behaviour to a certain level of risk. So one classic example, the introduction of compulsory seatbelt wearing led to otherwise more risky driving and an increase in other types of car-related accidental injury. Those who suggest we needn't worry about moral hazard in geoengineering argue that similar risk adjustment, in this case reducing mitigation, might be rational because geoengineering reduces the social risk of climate change in a different way. And reflecting such ethical assumptions, many economic modelling studies suggest reduced or delayed mitigation when geoengineering is included. But because of information asymmetry and cognitive biases, David Morrow suggests that mitigation may be deterred by a greater than rational amount. He also notes that even rational risk adjustment is not necessarily morally neutral. Back to seatbelts, much risk was transferred to backseat passengers and to other road users, not the drivers themselves. Economic definitions sometimes recognise this injustice. Paul Krugman defines moral hazard as any situation in which one person makes the decision about how much risk to take, while someone else bears the cost if things go badly. With geoengineering, those who might decide to deploy it and rationally reduce mitigation are most likely to be in a different country and indeed a different generation to those facing the worst of the impacts if geoengineering proves either defective or ineffective. So in practice, I think we need to recognise a broad socio-economic technical system will determine whether moral hazard is greasing the slippery slope to SRM deployment, or if instead, as the National Academy of Sciences said recently, we can research it in ways that help us better understand the climate system, the possible interventions in it, and the limits to our understanding, while at the same time we accelerate mitigation in the hope of either never needing SRM or at least only using it as a complement to mitigation and CDR. And I think one phrase in that, understanding the limits to understanding, is critical. I think we face a control dilemma. Discourses of the Anthropocene give us a misplaced confidence in the controllability of Earth systems. And they're sort of self-defined, suggesting control. If we place greater reliance on geoengineering, but it fails to deliver, humanity is very unlikely to be able to compensate by then accelerating mitigation and adaptation. Yet if geoengineering does deliver, our technological hubris is fueled, potentially exposing us to new and greater environmental challenges. And perhaps worse, increasing our reluctance to tackle injustice and unsustainability by political and cultural routes. Moreover, as Andy Sterling has highlighted, in framing the alternative as catastrophe, Anthropocene discourses also encourage an authoritarian depoliticisation of climate policy. In this, geoengineering exemplifies a contemporary post-political trend of what Evgeny Morozov calls technological solutionism. Arguments that because of high leverage and low cost, SRM could somehow sideline politics reach an extreme in which deployment by a single actor, a rogue geoengineer or a climate vigilante, is postulated. Now, Bill Gates seems the favourite for the role of philanthropic vigilante in such framings. Elon Musk apparently is committed to mitigation or else leaving the planet. But from Tony Stark to Bruce Wayne, superheroes help us, our superhero stories emphasise the ethical dilemma in vigilantism, the tension between justice and the rule of law. So stories of the Dark Knight illuminate the need for oversight, accountability, and civil liberties, even or indeed especially in times of crisis. They also remind us that while public sympathy for vigilantism signals that something is badly wrong with the system, this does not ethically justify the actions of the vigilante. Put bluntly, just because climate policy and governance is broken presently, this alone does not make geoengineering, even with democratic oversight, the right answer. In Gotham, the need is to eliminate the corruption that enables criminality to flourish, not to give policemen the license to emulate Batman and terrorise the criminals. Now, in practice, unilateral geoengineering, whether by states or philanthropists, seems implausible. Yet, claims that SRM is high leverage, low cost and apolitical persist, and could yet encourage the emergence or the prospect of covert geoengineering. As others have suggested, the fears of chemtrailers may not be wrong, merely premature. If SRM becomes bogged down in global negotiations, might not powerful actors be tempted by the emergency rhetoric to avoid due process? I don't know, I'm just asking. However, in practice, I think there is a dangerous temptation of treating SRM as an excuse for further delay, even cost-effective mitigation. Some researchers have been quick to dismiss the effects of poor character or moral hazard, but as expenses and lobbying scandals repeatedly reveal, political and corporate elites are susceptible to temptation, and, according to psychological research, are more likely to cheat and act unethically than poorer groups in society. And in other experiments recently, people with self-enhancing values focused on the accrual of wealth, power, and status were found to be more vulnerable to the idea of moral hazard in geoengineering. So I think we should be concerned about whether the decision makers do have the moral character to take tough decisions on mitigation and adaptation, rather than treating geoengineering as a political excuse. I think this is more likely than ordinary people seeing geoengineering as a reason to stop doing mitigation. It is indeed possible that they might see it as more wacky and unpalatable and increase support for mitigation, the so-called negative moral hazard. Could this be used more generally to win public and political support for rapid mitigation? Well, we could consider nuclear power. There's a parallel here. In Germany, where reduced energy consumption is central to the energy vendor, fears of nuclear's dark side have helped to drive coherent and ethical climate policy. Yet elsewhere, like in the UK, we see this policy actively misrepresented. Nuclear power, tightly linked to the existing elite power structures, is still presented as essential, and Germany's choice to reject it is ridiculed as climate failure. I wonder whether SRM would be treated any differently if a country tried to use it to incentivise mitigation. Yet, moral hazard does not mean we should avoid discussing and researching geoengineering, rather that we do it openly and with anticipation. There are unfortunately no simple decision rules or assessment procedures. Ethical questions always involve contextual judgments and require moral wisdom. The crux is to be aware, reflective and reflexive in practice, considering the ethics of each proposal from a range of perspectives. It is telling me I need to start wrapping up, so I'm not going to tell you a lot about responsible innovation. That's been written elsewhere. But I am going to try to reassure you, I am not here trying to hinder further SRM research. I actually think there's two reasons why humanity should now be engaging with geoengineering as well as with climate change. There's a capacity, capability, and complicity. By capability, I mean that ethical duties can arise directly from our capacity to act to prevent or mitigate harm or injustice. And that is happening with climate change. Justice therefore demands that those with the knowledge, power, and resources to act should do so, seeking to avert dangerous climate change and restore a more hospitable climate. Complicity means that our capability is reinforced by actions from responsibility. we have benefited materially from those actions should act as far as our capabilities stretch. But what should those actions be? Clearly, we should withhold from doing more damage by cutting our excessive consumption. But justifying positive actions, geoengineering most of them, seems trickier in ethical terms. There may be obligations as a result of our complicity. And in that case, they come perhaps like restorative justice, which demands that criminals apologise to their victims or undertake community service. CDR might be interpreted in that way. SRM? I'm not sure. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to skip a large chunk here. And this probably won't sound like it follows, but I've talked a little bit about climate as a restoration. David talked about climate as restoration. And I think, sorry, I'm going to abuse the privilege of being up here. Climate as restoration, that is a complex idea. It frames us as having control, but there are ethical distinctions between the control we enjoy over an artifact, a building, for example, and a natural system, such as a human body or an ecosystem. In the latter, we recognise our inability to return the system to a prior state, still less to an original design. And instead, we seek to establish conditions in which the system can re-establish relative autonomy, agency, and health for itself. Even in the former case, we recognise that seeking the perfect restoration of a historic artefact is misleading and inappropriate. Instead, we understand, as Richard Sennett highlights, that changing materials and purposes imply a process of reconfiguration, and thus we demand transparency in repair work. The Japanese art of kintsugi involves repairing broken pottery with golden cement or lacquer, which highlights the experience of breakage and repair. This makes a virtue of repair, makes the process legible, and leaves a durable reminder of the fragility of the subject. One paragraph is now punchline, but arguably, the thing most in need of restoration or reconfiguration is not the climate itself, but humanity's relationship with the environment. Our exploitative, instrumental relationship with the earth has led us into grave problems. To re-establish the conditions in which a healthy relationship can flourish, we need to lose our technocratic hubris and obtain the virtue of being reconciled with the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Thought-provoking talk. I must say I was a little bit...
Microphone, Peter.
I'm not sure how many of the films I've actually seen. From a personal perspective, in respect to the film, whenever I've had contact with large numbers of people and talked about geoengineering and SRM, people at anything on the moral hazard point are more concerned to reduce CO2 emissions if solar engineers are even thinking of these things. And the feedback that I get from 95% of people is, for heaven's sake, let's reduce CO2 emissions faster, but make sure we understand the risks and the alternatives better.
No, I was rushing through that point, but I think I was trying to be clear that at the personal level, I think there is relatively, the negative moral hazard is possible. It is, however, the case in the IAGP dialogues and the transcripts there that what caused that turnaround in people in the day was actually learning more about climate change. It wasn't the Heath Robinson nature of geoengineering, although that had a minor contribution.
Thank you very much for your talk. I don't really buy into the idea that people who are insured take more risks because I watched police camera action. But the real issue that you perhaps haven't quite addressed is the possibility that we know something about the human suffering that will be consequent by climate change. It's in the 2009 Lancet report. And we also know it affects mostly poorer countries. The real danger and the real moral problem is that we scroll forward perhaps 2 decades, whereupon suddenly politicians decide that something must be done and launch into climate engineering without the proper preparative work which would have been funded during that 2 decades, which I fear may not be funded. And the consequence of that will be it will end up as the most appalling project and cause even more suffering.
I think I was trying to say that with my comments about the control data, that we are the result of considering geoengineering in its embedded, socially embedded and ethically labelled form is that, as Amartya Sen said last night, we need to research it properly. We might decide it's a false hope and we're not going to go down that route. And we need to ensure that we do that research in ways that does not encourage any, whether we call it moral hazard or risk adjustment or whatever, amongst the decision-making community who must accelerate their efforts on mitigation and adaptation, because that suffering is happening and it is affecting the poorest most already.
Oh. I'm a writer. I'm very struck by the tragic nature of your imagination. I think you have to understand in the example of Batman, it's not that Gotham is ever going to be good. Batman will make Gotham and Gotham will make Batman. Similarly, Paul Atreides tries to save the universe and unleashes the worst war that has ever been seen. Similarly, for all he wants power and responsibility, all violence and responsibility, when it's dead, and Uncle Ben is dead, and Peter's life is tragic. And I wonder, you keep taking these examples, and this is not, it's fun, but at the same time, it seems to me that you do, to some extent, go through this discussion of basically fallen sense of the world. And then your restoration comes very beautifully out at the end. But are you sure that taking examples from popular tragedy is the right way to look at it?
That's a good challenge. I think I probably didn't think that through at that level in deciding to use those. I wanted to find a device that would help an audience of engineers and scientists connect a little more with the questions of ethics that I wanted to put in front of them.
I think you did that.
So thank you. But I think the point about tragedy is one I should go away and reflect on.
Well said.
Hello, Ian Simpson, campaigner against climate engineering.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
My name is Ian Simpson. I am a campaigner against climate engineering programs, specifically aerosol injection. I think I represent the anxieties of most of the public. You touched on some really important points in that talk. I think the main problem is one of trust, which was also covered last night and various other places during these talks. But there seems to be an undercurrent of the public are not able to understand the science and therefore not able to take the relevant decisions. But obviously from the public's point of view, we will insist that we are informed, and I think it's only fair to do so. And I feel that the dialogue between the scientific community and the public is almost non-existent, and that's creating a big problem, and it's exacerbating the fears and insecurities of the public. And I think the main things that I would propose, and I think I'll probably speak for many members of the public, is trust, accountability, transparency, and monitoring, and continuous reassessment and power to veto. I'm referring to proposed programs, obviously mine.
Sorry, so your question is what?
Is, would he agree that there needs to be more dialogue between the scientific community and the public to reassure them?
I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to circulate the full text. And yes, I'm absolutely convinced there needs to be more dialogue, there needs to be more public deliberation. What is critical in building trust, something Nora didn't say last night but has said it before, is to demonstrate trustworthiness. And to do that, one has to be open and vulnerable to the other party. And I think both sides of these discussions need to do that. What the public deliberation I've been involved in reveals is that people can be trusted, do think these things through properly, do come up with meaningful understanding. And I would echo Professor Sen's call last night for much more public debate and deliberation in this space.
Thank you. I think one last question.
I'll throw the university. Thanks, Duncan. I wonder if we just heard today, Keith, where you said people wouldn't be willing to spend money on losing more slowly. That implies a notion of winning being lower temperatures, basically. You seem to be suggesting a different version of winning. Or a broader one, do you want to just that's what is winning in your
I might be slightly reserved about talking about winning and losing, but I take very seriously the point that at the bottom of the option trade is suffering, and suffering, particularly suffering that is the result of our collectively wealthy humankind's responsibility, is something that needs to be minimised. I think I go back to what I just said. We're not going to find a perfect solution. We're not going to find the institutions, transcendental institutions of a just society, and certainly not in geoengineering. What we can do is make the best steps we can as people to move towards more justice, towards less suffering, and I think that part of that is rediscovering the potential for virtue in a healthy relationship with the earth, and the potential that everyone has to enjoy the capabilities for a flourishing life, and to do what we can to establish the conditions in which they can do that for themselves. So this idea of establishing conditions for autonomy, for agency and flourishing, not for setting the goals of winning or losing.
I think at that point we should go to third on to thank Duncan, because the whole idea of this conference is to actually get dialogue not only on the science of engineering, but the transparency of what's being discussed. And I think you've got within that.
So completely thinking that Jim passed the hour, that would give us a good time to chat. Oh, my name is Sasha from University. So the security people are very good.
I really do recommend it. It's like come up together and write it. So, you should be surprised what the change
I'm going to talk now, I'm sorry. I don't know. Well, I assume it's public, but I can't really, I think it's sort of, Can I just say, I apologise that the Wi-Fi is gone down, and we'll try and fix it. I'm not sure why.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session, the very technical session on teaching assistance. My name is Kirsty. In the engineering department, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. He's known to all of you, it's Dr. Hugh Hunt, senior lecturer in the engineering department.
Thank you very much. Now, Kirsty, before you go away, Kirsty, as you all know, has done all the work for the conference. I just think she deserves a huge. The other person who's done a huge work for the conference too is Claire Whittaker. Maybe at the end of my talk we can get her. Okay, I'm going to firstly give you a little demonstration of something that any climate scientist ought to have seen, and it's about chaos. The climate is a chaotic system, it's a non-linear system, and any non-linear system is rather difficult to forecast. So here I have a double pendulum, which I'll start like this, and I will let it go. And I'm going to do it once, and it behaves in some way. This is a 2-degree of freedom system. It has one mass there and another mass there. Okay. This is 2 degrees of freedom. Right, now I'm going to start off with the same initial conditions. Okay, it's different. I can do it again and again with the same initial conditions, and it'll be different. So this is just what happens with nonlinear systems. But notice the first very few half a second is pretty predictable. So let's do it again. Every time I do it, I'm pushing the top to the left, and then seeing what kind of the bottom to the right. It does the same thing for the first, just a few little bit, and then it does other stuff. Which is like the weather. We can see that the weather's going to do stuff, and then it does something different. The next thing to observe is that any nonlinear system can be linearized. So we have small motion of a nonlinear system, and this is really extremely predictable and very easy to understand. But it's also rather easy to control a nonlinear system. I'm doing it extremely effectively. That, just because it's nonlinear, does not make it uncontrollable. That's that demonstration, which has nothing really to do with my talk. The SPICE project, Matt Watson is going to be talking much more in general about the SPICE project, so I'm just going to talk about work package 2, which is about delivery systems for people. Many in the room might have met Hillary. Chris is here, is going to talk soon. Best you know, Matt Courtier is here. Hillary was here the other day. Andy Elson helped us with balloon experiments. And we're looking at how we might deliver particles to the stratosphere. Lots of options, but let's suppose as engineers we need to be given a brief. Engineers are given a brief. If you want an engineer to design you a bridge, you've got to tell the engineer how long you want the bridge to be, how much traffic. And once you give the engineer the brief, off we go. 10 million tons of particles at a 20 kilometre height, mid-latitude. I don't know, let's just pick some numbers. And then we start looking at the sums. We could use aircraft, airships, we could do batch-type delivery systems. Make assumptions. 1 ton payload means 30 flights a day. Maybe you've got a 10-ton payload aircraft, that's 3,000 flights a day. They're the kind of things you have, the sums you have to do. We could do missiles and so on. Let's suppose we can get a missile with a 300 kilogram payload, then that means an awful lot of missiles per day. We could do artillery, same sort of thing. These things come to ground, there's the cleanup, which we have to deal with, the recovery. You must think of all of these. Towers. Well, bear in mind that that's our 20 kilometres we want to get to. This is up to scale, the Burj Khalifa. Chris Brightening will talk a little bit more about that. So we've thought about this balloon idea, and it was it's all a bit fanciful, I suppose. When Peter Davidson first mentioned it to me, I thought it was ridiculously fanciful. But it's just on the edge of fanciful, and that's for me what makes it an interesting engineering challenge. So let's look at some work that was done mainly by Chris Brightening and Matt Courtier, Peter Davidson and myself, on the development time in years, and like any of these things, it's a first stab, it's our best guess, and other people have done similar sums. This has cost billions of pounds, and as David Keith quite rightly says, it's cheap. You can build a nuclear power station for this amount of money, so this is cheap. Even if whatever costs we might want to put for these higher cost technologies, they're achievable. It just happens, I think, that if the technology for tethered balloons were feasible, then this becomes stupidly cheap and probably very easily implemented by just about anybody. So we ought to know what the risks are and what the technology entails, rather than not swirling around in the wind. This same tether, try to predict that. When it's in the wind, if you even though this is only the weight of the tether that's causing it to come down, whereas here, nobody can without these experiments. With no wind at all, put that tether up there. Trying to predict this motion would be a bit tricky. We've got models, but this is just behind the Fitzwilliam Museum where we had our reception. And the kind of well, that would be probably at 20 kilometers actually. But anyway, that's the kind of thing we need to do. So we've got models. And the idea is that finite models are cool, and you piece together things, and we look at, as the wind increases, how will this tether fall over? And what's interesting is it's just complicated by the density of air changing with height, and the balloon, how much you need to fill the balloon up by depends on where the balloon is. But it's nice to do some little thought experiments about what might happen if the tether would break, because engineers are always concerned about safety. And this is the classic experiment of what happens when you flick a rubber band onto your younger sister's skin. That's why it hurts. This is what happens when you flick a rubber band across the room. And this is the kind of fun we have as engineers modeling dynamics. And the model, well, you've just seen a video which doesn't look anything like this, because this is only a two-dimensional model, and when you get into 3 dimensions, it gets ridiculously complicated. One thing we've been thinking about doing to reduce the aerodynamic drag on the tether, you notice in the video I showed you before that the wind was blowing a balloon over, but if you go up to 20 kilometers, the tether is the elephant in the room, the wind is blowing the tether over, and the tether quite possibly would be in a jet stream where the winds are pretty fast. If we can make aerodynamic the shape of the tether, give it some kind of streamlined shape, then that's a bonus. But then we get the Tacoma Narrows type flutter and all sorts of weird, wonderful things, which actually are really quite hard to understand for very, very long structures, because there's no such thing as modes of vibration. We've got traveling waves, and it just gets complicated. So Andy Elson helped us to build a rig to make this shape tether, and Peter Davidson was a design consultant on this work, and then we thought we'd go out and do an experiment. A 1 kilometre test bed was proposed, and we were going to go out with a 1 kilometre hydraulic hose. It was thought at the sand pit where Spice was conceived that this would be a great opportunity to, as a sort of take a photo to be able to put on the front page of the website, just so people will get an image of what it is that we're doing and how exciting it is and why it's important. Well, so Duncan quite rightly said that we came into this whole project rather pretty naive, and we learned pretty fast. I now know that ethics is not some county in the east of England, and it's pretty important. It's pretty important to be open and honest and transparent. I know that Honora O'Neill doesn't like the word transparency. I don't like that word either, because if I have a machine which is transparent, which means it's like glass, you can't see how it works. So transparency to me can mean that actually you can't see anything. Well, there you go. But I think that this conference, thanks by the way to Nick Breeze, I think he deserves a round of applause. He's streaming this all live on the internet, and it's all going to be packaged up so that anybody anywhere can view it afterwards, download bits and pieces, and it's a real resource now. And it's because it's being streamed live, it means that we don't really have anywhere to hide, and I think that's a great thing. We ought to be doing that kind of thing. Right, so our test bed is what we were going to be looking at all these kinds of motions. It's interesting, if you've got lots of tension, like in this one here, it's easy to model this. I'll wiggle this around, the balloon has got a lot of tension here. But when you're just trying to get away with the bare minimum, like here, the balloon has not got so much tension in it. And this is where things get difficult. And if I move this around, then it's harder to understand than if I move this around. And it looks obvious, but it's really important that we have the models validated. So our test bed was going to be carried out at this airfield in Norfolk, and it was safe and legal. But we had to go through a process which involved framing, looking at the nature and purpose, or external communication, and looking at future applications and associated impacts. I mean, might this technology be used for something other than climate engineering? Might it be used for, who knows, what impacts would that have? And looking at public and stakeholder views. Well, this was something we never even thought we'd have to be dealing with, but anyway, it came. And for these reasons, we were given a green light on these and a light on those, so we couldn't carry on with the test bed. There were various other complications, but in the end we thought we're not going to have enough time in our project to do this test bed properly. Kirsty has been looking at balloon dynamics, because when you fill a balloon, it wobbles around. You can hear that acoustically here. I'll give this a whack. You hear that, but when the balloon is the size of a large football ground, okay, that's Kirsty's work. And then Richard Shaw was doing an amazing business work, because when the tether is a long way away, we can't instrument it, because it's hard to get instrumentation with a thin thing. You can't see it, but with really good signal processing, image processing, magically you can, with a couple of cameras, you can reconstruct the position. Chris is going to talk about the tether itself and the issues of making something really strong. Kirsty looked at a lot of pumping considerations, and when you look at phase diagrams, temperature and pressure of things like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen, well, all gases go solid under sufficient pressure. Sulfur dioxide is sitting around a region where the liquid solid region is all around the temperatures where we are looking at pumping. And there's a good chance we'll end up solidifying sulfur dioxide if we try to move it up the pipe. So that's why nitrogen looks like a good thing to try. Nitrogen, of course, is 80% of the atmosphere. So the initial experiments we could do at 20 kilometers would be to see if we can pump nitrogen. Like pumping water into the oceans, it ought to be something that we could frame in the right way. But that gives you a flavour of our project. Pumping issues, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen. Nitrogen could be used to transport solid particles like titanium dioxide. But the key message is that that engineering and delivery system is not simple, not a short-term project. It's a major aerospace program. That's essentially what it is. Delivery height to 20 kilometers is possibly okay with aircraft and balloons and things. 25 kilometers, the air density gets low, it's more difficult. And we just don't know enough in the engineering world about the systems that we're trying to engineer. Research is essential. Outdoor experiments are essential too. Thank you very much. Yeah, is it time for questions? Do you want to answer the questions?
Shall we have time for last few questions? Stephen?
Steve Salter, Edinburgh University. You've been having lots of great fun. I did do a little bit of thinking about this a long time ago, and I came up with a solution which used the same paired tether, but I had multiple balloons with control surfaces and even a bit of propulsion on them. And the idea was that one or two could break, and you could still recover. You could lose the control and still recover. is there a good reason for having just one really big balloon high up?
The answer to that is that we have to look at all possible options. And if there are good reasons for having multiple balloons and are good ways of doing it, and if there are good reasons why a single balloon is impossible, I think what we do as engineers is we explore the terrain and we make decisions based on timescales, cost, feasibility, risk, safety. There's a multi-dimensional process, and we have to put all possibilities into them.
It solves your question.
It would do. Of course, it would solve lots of problems if it can be done. But this has been a small project, and there's plenty of scope for more work.
Yes, in the front here.
You've hit one of the barriers that engineers often forget, which is the social barriers, and it was a profound one by the sound of what I've read. Have you had any thoughts about how you might create a process that would make the slippery slope argument less credible, and therefore make it more likely to punch through that critical argument?
Well, I was asked recently about my views on this subject, and I'll say to anyone that I hope that none of these geoengineering technologies ever get implemented. And the journalist was surprised that I was hoping that my work would never be used. And that's what I believe. But what I believe is that there's a real risk that it will be used, and we need to make sure that if it's going to be used, it's used safely and responsibly. And we cannot make decisions in ignorance. And we want to know why something is not going to be safe. We have to do research into the safety of that technology. If we don't do that research, then we will make bad decisions.
Yeah, just as a follow-up question, because I agree completely with that. But the question is, for those who are sceptical, who are concerned about a rollout process in which they have no control, so they see each research step as part of a larger process which wrests control from them. The question is, how do those of us who believe that research ought to take place, how do we reassure people that they will have increasing control over any subsequent steps? And I was just wondering, you've been through this mill, and I'm just wondering what insights you might have picked as to how that reassurance might take place. Or have you sort of basically thrown in the towel and said, no, well, that's somebody else's problem?
I think that the 1 kilometre test bed, which didn't happen, is the reason that this conference is here today. I think that we went through this mill, we've come out the other side, and actually we've been able to on that platform, put together this conference. I think where's the man? Is that a fair thing to say that?
Yeah, I will try and address some of these questions this afternoon.
I didn't hear that, sorry.
I've got a couple of slides on this afternoon.
Okay, so Matt's going to talk about that this afternoon. But suppose the 1 kilometre test bed had gone ahead.
Yeah.
Suppose we'd been allowed to do it, and suppose we'd been really, really told, by the way, this is going to be scrutinised very heavily, and it has to be framed properly. Well, I think that would have been a great test bed, not for our balloon dynamics, but for all the questions you asked. We missed an opportunity, in my view. I think that was just unfortunate.
At the back.
So, Hugh, what if you had private...
Can I just do a microphone, please?
Hugh, what if you had private funding and you went out in the middle of the Pacific, so you weren't violating anybody's airspace, then what would keep you from doing your experiment?
Well, what I think is quite possible is that this technology would be very useful to the telecommunications industry. And because it may well be that satellites in orbit are going to suffer from space debris, maybe we'll need to think of putting balloons up with fibre optic communication systems and for 7G networks. Is that geoengineering?
But Hugh, I mean, for the moment, I mean, couldn't you do this experiment someplace else with private funding?
I personally wouldn't want to do that. I think that that would look bad. The answer is, of course, yes. But somebody else might do it. Okay, I think we'll move on. Okay, so thank you to Kirsty for sharing my bit of multi-handed experience. We've got Chris Burgoyne, who is also no stranger to this room. Is a reader in structural engineering here, and has been working on the SPICE project and looking after Matt Corsier as his PhD student.
Okay, thank you, Hugh. I'm Chris Burgoyne. I'm not a proper engineer according to Hugh. I'm a structural engineer. I like my structures to stand where they are, and so they don't move around very much. I regard Hugh's dynamic stuff as a perturbation away from the basic static case. So we've been looking at some of the static issues that arise with a balloon and a tether. And of course, everybody says, well, it's just a garden hose hanging from a balloon, isn't it? It's incredibly simple. Well, actually, there's quite a lot more to it than that, and I'll skate over this quite quickly. One or two things I want to say. We were charged with the idea of saying we wanted to deliver 10 million tons of stuff to the stratosphere. We don't know what stuff is, we don't know what the properties of what we're going to carry it in, but that's basically the issue. And there were claims that said, with modern materials, you can easily build a tower that's 20 kilometers tall. This is Burj Khalifa, which Hugh referred to. I've been up as far as they allow you to go to the observation deck, which is about there. Above this are exceedingly expensive flats. Anyway, it's an interesting structure. Just for a matter of scale, that's what a 20 kilometer tower would look like. And depending upon which part of the world you live in, what you regard as a high piece of ground is there. This is actually wider in diameter at the bottom than Burj Khalifa is tall. So we're talking about a serious structure. And the point about this, and this is something I did want to get over, is that this is not governed by strength. It's governed by stiffness. That this would buckle under its own weight. And the governing parameter for this, you can non-dimensionalize it, is this ratio of Young's modulus to the density of the material. And that's a ratio that you have almost no control over. The range of that ratio for virtually all materials is in the range of 2 or 3. So it doesn't change very much as your materials change. This is a geometrical ratio which is related to the cross-section of the element you're dealing with, and that varies from R over root 2 to R over 2. There's not very much variation in that. And this leads us to the conclusion that, of course, to make a rigid tower, Hugh's shown this already, you're dealing with material in compression, whereas to make a tethered balloon, you're dealing with material in tension. And there's a huge difference in the efficiency with which you use the materials, and that's primarily what gives you the difference between these two cases. So we started off with the idea that we want a balloon, and my element of it was saying, well, what's the tether going to be made from? And you've got the situation where at the top you've got to hang all the tether from it, at the bottom you've got to resist all the hydrostatic pressure of whatever stuff you're putting into it. So you have a change in properties as you go up. And there's a concept which I've never had a use for before until now, which is called the free length of the material. That is how much of the material will actually hang from itself. You end up, at the time you want, if you want something that's 20 odd kilometers tall, you want, not all of it's going to be effective, you want some of it to carry bursting, you quite like a safety factor. So you're looking at materials which have a free length of 130 kilometers or thereabouts. And this is governed by this ratio between the strength and the density of the material. And here are some possible materials, just a range of things. Ordinary steel, the sort of stuff your car is made from, has got a free length of 3. The best steel in the world, pre-stressing steel, has got a free length of 26 kilometers, and various other things around here. We cut that lot out because they're not strong enough. We cut carbon nanotubes out because that's the figure that applies to a molecule. It's not the figure that applies to an assemblage of it yet. We cut carbon fibers out because we don't want to put a lightning conductor up there. We're not concerned really about whether we would disturb the meteorological environment from lightning. If you've got one lightning strike down your tether, it would fry. So that's that. So we're left with these two materials, aramids, which you probably know as Kevlar, and a material called PBO. And everybody asks me what PBO stands for. It's that. There'll be a short test after this lecture. The essence of this is that PBO is incredibly straight. So this is the molecule. That link there links up, is almost directly in line with that link there. So this is PBO. This is an aramid. There are several different versions of aramids, but Kevlar is one of them. And you can see that the PBO is more highly aligned than the Kevlar. Kevlar's pretty good, but PBO is better. Now, we've done a lot of work here before this, looking at the properties of Kevlar. This was done in association with designing bridges and so on. There's a phenomenon with these materials called creep rupture, that they will creep until eventually they will fail. And we need to know what that number is to know what strength we can use in them. So we've done lots of work beforehand on Kevlar, and we also looked at the temperature sensitivity of this, primarily with a view to saying what happens if my structure is out in the desert somewhere where it's quite warm. We haven't done any work on PBO, and neither, to our knowledge, has anybody else. So Matt Cozier's PhD was largely about doing analyses of the behaviour of PBO, and I'm not going to go through that, we've got time to go through the details of it. But the result of this is that we've got predictions for the behaviour of PBO at different load levels over lengths of time. The green is real creep data, the black is accelerated test data extrapolated. And the conclusion from this is that if we want to leave the load on PBO for a year, we can put on stresses of the order of 65–60% of the short-term strength. And that's good enough. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. We also can predict the temperature sensitivity of it, and that's important because this line here, which is the lifetime against stress, this would apply to the stuff that's up there, where it's very cold, whereas the curves down here would apply to the bit that's close to the Earth's surface. How will we make the tether? There are various things you can do. You've got to resist some bursting, you've got to resist some axial force, so you're going to need several sets of fibres knocking around in there. The reason it's not like a garden hose is that this one is what a garden hose looks like. You have fibres crossing at 63 degrees because that balances the forces. But we're talking about forces which change as you go up, and you have serious abrasion problems with that. So we cut those out, and I'm going to skip to this quite quickly. We come to the conclusion that the best way of dealing with it is to have one set of fibres internally for dealing with the bursting, and then an axial tension element on the outside. And that raises then issues about the bursting. Because if you have a thin shell like this with an internal pressure, then the stress across here is the same. You don't get any variation, and you get a very simple result of a trivial calculation. An A-level student should be able to deal with that. But our tether won't be thin, it will be thick. So if you have a thick water pipe and you have an isotropic material, the stress varies across the cross-section. So it's bigger on the inner surface than it is on the outer surface. And this is well known. It's a classical solution derived in Victorian times. It's used for making gun barrels, pressure vessels, all of these are designed using this. But our materials aren't isotropic. The properties actually and transversely differ. And what you find is that this, essentially what's happening is that the tube is squashing transversely. And this has a big effect because it means that the inner bit has got to do more than the outer bit can do. And this requires a new analysis which Matt has done, and I'm not going to go through the details, but the important part about this is that the governing ratio that's important is the ratio between the stiffness transversely and the stiffness longitudinally. And all of these materials we're looking at are optimized in order to get all the good properties in the longitudinal direction. And if we've done work for other purposes looking at aramids like Kevlar, we find that the transverse modulus is about 3, by comparison with the longitudinal modulus is about 130. The manufacturers of PBO quote an even worse ratio for PBO. The fact you get good properties that way means you have poor properties at right angles to it. And both of these give you limiting internal pressures of about 130 megapascals. Hugh's telling me to speed up. So I want to just, I think we're going to do something briefly here, looking at how much can the balloon lift. And the lift that's available is about 75 grams per cubic meter. So every bit you want to lift, you've got to have that cubic meters of balloon up there. And one of the important issues about this is how this varies with height. And the internal pressure, this is how the internal pressure varies with height, and this is how the lift varies with height. And our design point is somewhere around here. And the important corollary of that is that if the balloon sinks, the internal pressure drops and you lose the solidity of the balloon. It ends up like one of those rather than the big one at the top there. If the balloon rises, you lose lift, at which point it won't then be able to pick up its tail. I'm going to sketch over these. I'm looking at a strategy for how we might control the height of the balloon. And we're trying to keep the balloon between its maximum height and the height at which it depressurizes. And we can do various things. We can pay out the tether. We can leave it alone. We can pay the tether out. In the limit, if things get really bad, we can empty the tether. And the important result of that is that the length of the tether has to be variable during deployment by the order of a couple of kilometers. So we've got to be able to pay out and draw in a couple of kilometers of material. Very briefly about the launch issues. When you start off with a balloon on the ground, you have a very small volume of helium inside it, which expands as you go up. That's not an issue for a free-flying balloon because there's no wind across it. But if you have a tethered balloon and it's going up through the atmosphere, the airflow over the top is going to be smooth because this is taut, whereas the airflow over the underside is going to be very poor because it's free. And this is a major issue. So in summary, we've got some important results out of this. The towers are governed by buckling and they're impractical. The tethers are governed by tension and they're much cheaper. There's a limited number of materials which are possible, and the aramids for PBO are basically the only ones we've come across. PBO is adequate. The transverse properties of the fibers are important. The balloon lift is very sensitive to height, and we need to be able to change the length by several kilometers. And finally, there are launch issues. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Chris. Questions then? We've got over this side, that's Ken, I think. Over, where's the other? Oh, that Ken.
of sun, and so that the material strengths and pressures and so on would be less in each stage. Would you like to comment about?
Yeah, one of the issues we haven't looked at in detail in what I presented is how you anchor these things. And if you say that you want to have something which has got multiple stages to it, that means every time you have a multiple stage, you have two more anchors, one for the bit going down, one for the bit going up. And our initial thought, at least, is that we would try to avoid anchorages. Anchorages are seriously difficult things to do. And if you have an anchorage at the top, it's only got to deal with the tension. And if you have an anchorage at the bottom, for our system, it's only got to deal with the pressure. The other issue you get is that these intermediate balloons are sitting in air which has got much higher wind speeds. And that really changes the dynamics of what we're talking about here. It's getting into the stage. One of the advantages of the balloon being up at 20 kilometers is that wind speeds at 20 kilometers are much lower than wind speeds below that. So it's possible, but I think we would, if we can do it in a single stage, we would do it in a single stage.
Right at the back, right back, yeah. But yeah, we just said this, and then we'll go back to.
I have a question for both of you, which you suggested you used the sort of a description of the scale of this project, etc. I think you used aerospace. I need some comparable. So the question: what's the scale, and what timetable do you imagine? How long does such a project actually, for the development, testing, take? Is there any ballpark based on
Chris, time scale.
Balloons of the order of 100 meters in diameter exist. The oil industry is already making umbilicals that go 10, 20 kilometers down and through the sea. So the idea of actually manufacturing a tether, the idea of manufacturing a balloon, they wouldn't be the same as existing technologies, but they wouldn't be that different from it, I don't think. So I don't see a very long timescale needed. It would take quite a lot of investment for a plant to make a tether, and somebody's got to say it's a good thing to do in order to get somebody to do it. But I don't see it as being hugely complex. So I think a few years. If somebody said go, I think a few years would do it.
Hi, Andrew Lockley. Just a couple of quick questions. You respond to as many of them as well. Firstly, why don't you tether up a mountain, not on the ground level? Secondly, why don't you pre-stress the plate wall so that the interior is under compression? And thirdly, why don't you use some kind of mechanical furling device, like a kind of party whizzer thing that will take the tail of the balloon and wrap it up until the pressure is high enough to unwrap it?
I didn't get the first question. What's that?
On a mountain.
Oh, do it on a mountain? Fine, yes. Yes, I mean, we have actually looked at what a tower would look like if you built it on top of Mount Everest. It actually, you get rid of about 2/3 of the weight. There might be some issues about building on Mount Everest. Not least, you've still got to build the other 2/3 of it, which is going up. The issues of furling a balloon as it comes down, the airship people use balinets. So what they will do is they will have a balloon which is the same size down here as it is up there, but it's got an internal compartment of air. And as the balloon goes up, the air is dispersed. It is allowed out as the helium expands. When it comes down, you've got to pump back in again. And so this makes life a lot more complex if you have to do that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, we have looked at these possibilities. I was trying to give a quick summary for that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chris. And our next speaker is who's the next speaker? Is Julian? Is that right? Yes, is that right? I've got somewhere that's really there. This microphone, Chris, this one. I met Julian at the EPSIC sandpit when we were first talking about exploring what possibilities there were for spending UK research money on climate engineering, and he's going to talk about foaming the ocean. Oh, sorry, sorry, the wrong side. Sorry. It's like going forward dancing and
Thank you very much for the privilege of speaking at this important meeting. Can you hear me?
No. It's on. It's on.
Yeah. Over the years, we've made lots of different sorts of foams for different kinds of materials, and they all have one thing in common. They have a change of state. From a liquid, which allows biaxial elongation of flow when the foam cells are expanding, into a solid which resists the collapse under the driving forces of surface energy and the entropic relaxation of chain-extended molecules. So this is a titanium foam. The change of state is by polymerization. This is a fiber foam from metal matrix composites. The change of state is also polymerization. This foam is alumina and it's made using egg white, and the change of state is denaturing the protein by heating. This foam here is made in this, it's an alumina foam. It's made in the same way that cheesy wotsits are made. Cereal snacks, if you want to be technical, we went up to Camden and Chorley Food Research Association to use their high pressure steaming extruder. This is a copper foam. This is a hydroxyapatite foam. These are also made by polymerization. This is made in the same way that expanded polystyrene is made using a pentane blowing agent and steam chest molding. This is an iron foam. These are made for hard tissue scaffolds for bone repair by a process called solid free-forming, extrusion free-forming, which is similar to the colling pot from the Nile Delta 4000 BC. And these use, as the change of state, evaporation of solvent. The solvent is isopropyl alcohol, same as you use when you've got two wash hands when you go to hospital. And these can also be made for millimetre wave metal materials. So when we turn to foams for the ocean, and this picture is taken from the south coast of Colby Island in Pembrokeshire, and it encapsulates in one image reflectance of grassland, rock, ocean, and the breaking waves which produce this foam. We take forward this idea of a change of state which allows some permanence to the foam. And I acknowledge three MSc students who did this work, and also some of my colleagues who made useful contributions. The motivation is based on the Lancet report, and I don't really need to expand upon that, because I guess you will know. There have been some interesting examples of ocean foams and coastal waters which have long lives, and they're caused by wind shear on phytoplankton, and which releases proteins and other surfactants. So we're going to come back to the idea of using the ocean as a source of protein and surfactant in a moment. We know that the foam is reflective up to about 1.2 microns at about 50%, the ocean itself around about 5%, and we know that the spectrum of light which reaches the surface is mainly within that region below about 1.2, so we're in the right spectrum reflectance range for this to be useful. If we estimate the energy required to pump air, assuming full entrainment, to make a foam which is 1 kilometre squared and has a thickness of 10 millimetres, it's about 303 megajoules for that kilometre squared. But what matters is the average power that's required, so we have to divide by time. If the foam is a white cap and lasts only about 5 minutes, then the power required is 1 megawatt. It's absurd. If, however, we can make a foam which lasts for a month, then we need an energy of about 120 watts or 2 light bulbs. So, the whole emphasis of the research on ocean foams for the mirror is based around the idea of longevity, and the idea of longevity is based around the idea of change of state. That sets the research program, if you like, for this. Ocean whitecaps themselves do contribute to the Earth's radiation balance. They are related to the 10 meter wind speed, and it has one of many equations for area fraction of 1% requires a 25 meter wind speed, and on the Beaufort wind force scale, that's a storm. So that's the problem. Edward Monahan spent most of his career in University College Galway, west of Ireland, and committed himself to a study of the ocean boundary there, in particular to whitecaps, and he suggested that probably the reflectance of foam is related to the number of horizontal surfaces, and the vertical surface didn't have much contribution to make. And although you can do this very accurately by using matrices, you can arrive at a series for the first and third reflectances, the second one goes downwards. And so you can calculate the contribution of each individual layer, and in that way you can relate the volume of gas pumped directly to the reflectance. That's the important thing here. And we did this experiment with sheets of glass. And you can see the effect of each layer. The glass will get dirty, so you get some loss on you get some losses due to perfectly clean glass, but it follows a sort of formula. So, if the Royal Society wants an increase in surface albedo from 0.15 to 0.17, if it all comes from the ocean foam, and it's absurd to consider the possibility that the entire intention of 250 years of deliberate geoengineering climate upwards was the positive forcing by the enthusiastic fossil fuel burners should be remediated by one single intervention, but let's suppose it was, then we need to have something like 2.6 gigawatts, a small power station, and that energy has to be drawn from wind and wave. If we use vessels, then we're looking at something like 4,000 vessels. Just to give you an idea, there are 40,000 merchant ships worldwide. There's an interesting idea that's been around for a long time, that if you blow bubbles onto the hull of a ship, it reduces the amount of bunker fuel you have to burn. There are similar ideas indeed for aircraft fuel consumption, but they haven't been realised. And so that might become one of the ways of remediation. But I don't feel that we're ready to talk about the actual implementation of this until we know much more about the type of foam. We measure reflectance in a not 45-degree mode using a very, very simple piece of equipment, which the beam is provided by an old-fashioned slide projector. Messing about the optics a little bit, I bought it from eBay. And we use a barium sulfate standard, and we use a little photodiode which costs, I think, $1.75. And it's shunted, and there's a little resistor. And so we're really measuring current. We check for linearity using sheets of paper with squares on them, and we have a reference black which I made by using obviously treating copper. These are black copper oxide fibers, and the light is reflected about inside these little nanofibers. If you just bundle some surfactant into water, you get quite a range of reflectances, but the foam decays too quickly. Likewise with proteins, a range of proteins, they use in firefighting, but they too decay too quickly. So there are several ways of establishing the longevity of a foam. You can either measure the collapse volume associated with coalescence and bubble burst, or you can measure the drainage, which is the water that builds up at the bottom of the foam. They're different. So you can have a foam, for example, that doesn't collapse a great deal, but there's a lot of drainage, right? They're separate things. So single surfactants on their own are no good. So we began to explore the interaction of pectins and protein. And this is the idea. So these are this is a low methyl pectin, so you've got some consideration groups and some are esterified, and and then we're looking at proteins at the same time. And they do drain, but they leave behind a kind of biscuity sort of solid which has quite a high reflectance, as you can see here. Now we're up in the region of 70% for some of these, so higher than the 50% from which we estimated that. And we also tried combinations of cellulose ethers with our carrageenan gums. This is also used in the food industry. Provided you have sufficient carrageenan, we can get to a reasonably stable foam. But there's something interesting about the foam that I'd like to tell you about. Is you allow it to decay and it collapses initially because there's coalescence and bubble burst. And as a result of the reduced number of horizontal layers, the reflectance drops. As you allow it to dry, the reflectance mysteriously goes up. And this prompts us to do another experiment, a very, very simple experiment. I take a solution of sea salt, 35 grams per litre in water, nothing added. I take another solution of sea salt, 35 grams per litre, but with 0.5% of the cellulose ether. It's the same stuff that's used for thickening canned soup. And what I find is that there are little tiny, sorry, this one is actually from the top surface of the foam. Scanning electron micrograph showing submicron sized particles of sea salt. This is the slide I was on. Now what you see here on the left hand side is a plastic Petri dish painted black with matte black paint from Halfords. By me and not terribly skillfully. And on the right hand side, and it contains sea salt solution which is dried. On the right hand side, sea salt solution with the cellulose ether at 0.5%. So I think what this slide tells us is that, as it were out of the blue, not wishing to make too much of fun of that, sea salt kind of steps up to the plate as a potential solar radiation reflector. And the question now is how do we best make use of it? So the scanning electron micrograph shows, and this is the top surface. Oh, let me just be clear. There's no bubbles here. This is just a dried solution, and the thickness of that film is less than a millimetre. And it has a reflectance of 77%. And I think one of the best reflectances that you get in the natural world is from snow when it reaches 130 millimetres. It has a reflectance of 85%, which is why you take your goggles and you go skiing. This is for 1 millimetre. So what's interesting is that the cellulose ether has the effect of controlling or reducing the oscillate brightening that takes place during the drying process. The carrageenan gum, which was not in the last slide, but I also did that separately, does not allow that to happen. So it allows the sea salt particles to grow quicker. This is the effect of oscillate brightening from a tiny little drop of a sea salt solution on a gold-coated glass slide. Now we go to the reflectance results. These are the reference surfaces. Barium sulfate from the literature is 97%. On PTFE, which we also use, is very robust, 93%. The matte black Petri dish, this is because this variability is because of my lousy paint spraying. If you're trying to spray matte black paint and allow it to flood, it gets more shinier. The black standard is all less than 2%, which is what you hope for. The C-mix solution, which is simply a lot of sea salt poured out of a bag, 10 millimeters deep, itself produces nearly 80% reflectance. All right? That's without any messing about with it. The C-mix solution, which is evaporated, is useless because there's a lot of oscillate brightening. It produces 18% reflectance, but with the ether cell, it produces 77%. We saw that in the Petri dish. It's just a white surface, a millimeter or so thick. The solution with the carrageenan gum is much less because it allows the particles to grow. This is oscillate brightening. You know it if you're involved in climate. It also there in metallurgy, in ceramics and polymers as well. The small particles disappear and plate out on the large particles. I teach this, and I do teach it. I explain to students that they must not read any kind of political or economic text into it, because what it says is the big ones get bigger and the little ones disappear entirely. It happens also in faceted crystals because of the high proportion steps and edges where reprecipitation can occur. It's slightly different idea. It happens here because of the reduced number of nearest neighbour atoms on a convex surface. I think it's too early to talk about where these things will be deployed, but what people do talk about is the so-called ocean deserts, where there is very little marine life, and those little ocean desert regions are getting gradually bigger as climate change moves on. So in conclusion, I think we are now moving towards a long-lived ocean foam. We are going to start experiments using phytoplankton as the source of protein rather than land-based protein sources. We are already exploring carrageenans which derive from seaweed. And now we realise that sea salt itself steps up to the plate to act as a reflector for solar radiation. All these experiments can be done in a school science laboratory. The electron microscopy is only confirmatory. In fact, they can all be done in your own kitchen. I've tried to think of a simpler way of doing climate engineering, but I haven't succeeded. Thank you very much.
Is this stuff like a swimming in the picture when there's some of the stuff around?
Would be like swimming tomato soup. Would you do that? You probably do it for charity.
I would, yeah. Okay, we've got basically a question over there.
Thank you. David Santiago from the Greenpeace Research Labs. I just wonder if you can say anything about the potential ecological impacts of creating large areas of persistent foam-covered water and how that would impact on the water quality.
I think that's, first of all, I'm not an oceanographer, so it's entrepreneurial for me to try and comment on that. But what has been suggested to me is that the ocean deserts, because of the low marine life, would be the place to use it. But there's another issue, and that is the issue of bird migration pathways. And that is that if these are placed under migration pathways, birds will try to land on them because they are perceived to be ice floes. And the surfactants are not good for their waterproof nests. That's the correct word. So there are a whole raft of issues with every single geoengineering intervention. And I think at the end of the day, what people really want, they want a geoengineering remediation which will put right all the actions of burning fossil fuel without paying a penny for it and without the slightest bit of ecological change resulting from it. And they are going to be terribly, terribly disappointed, whichever way this turns out.
Yes, right up there. Yeah, there we go. And then right up the way back.
I missed something in the sea salt. Where is it deployed? Is it land-based, sea-based? How does it work?
All of the work I'm doing is to create a foam field on the ocean. The upper surface of the foam, we discover, has 500 nanometer salt particles in it, with a refractive index of 1.5, which scatter light very effectively and therefore are very good reflectors. And this only came about a month or so ago, and it opens the door to the idea of deploying sea salt, which I understand to be in a fairly prodigious supply, as an ocean reflector. But the best way to deploy that might not be this, there may be better ways, I don't know.
Thanks very much. The material, is it biodegradable? Because if it is, what's the length of, you talked about a month lifetime of it, but that's just because of physical constraints. If it's biodegradable, it will be food for something, and so it could be less than that. If it's not biodegradable, what impact is that going to have for the long days?
So let's step back a little bit, because one of the things we have to recognise is that in Britain at least, the scientific community has been, and I flirt with hyperbole if I say brainwashed, so I should really be a little bit more cautious and say strongly influenced by the idea of impact. The work that they do, they've spent so much time writing impact statements for their research grants, that they believe that every piece of work has to be relevant in the next few years. I am trying to develop a principle. We have sources of protein which interact with jelly agents. I am not saying that these are the final compositions that will be used. I would like to get the protein source from phytoplankton, which is a fantastic source of protein, and it's ingenerate. I would like to get the jelly agent also as an ingenerate resource, but I have to do experiments. So I've taken these materials as my experimental base. I think there will be people coming along after me who will improve brightening upon them. So yes, I think cellulose ethers are. It's basically hydroxyprofile, methyl cellulose. These are things which I think do degrade, either in UV or through biological action. But I haven't studied them. We are actually starting to do the effects of wave action, UV, and biodegradation on these.
One question here in the last.
Is there implications on evaporation of water?
Sorry?
Will there be implications on the evaporation of water and
yes.
on relative humidity in clouds? And then would you lose the albedo from clouds that you would gain from the foam?
Yes, there will be effects and consequences. The foam itself needs to dry to be effective because the gelation process relies on reducing the water content of the foam. So the chemical engineers here will immediately see that there are 4 or 5 mass transport processes all going on at once. It's a tremendous opportunity to do some mass transport modeling. But certainly once the foam is established, it will last perhaps a month. But I think it will break up into islands in the same way that the ice sheets break up into little islands. So, you know, there will be an area fraction still occupied, but they might not be contiguous.
Well, the last question here, I'm afraid of the one.
Phil Williamson, University of East Anglia and NURC. Further query on the ecological consequences. 2 thoughts come to mind. And firstly, the air-sea gas exchange that at present the oceans take up a lot of carbon dioxide, and if you have a foam layer, that will decrease, or there might be some areas of the world where there is that gassing. But the second consideration, although you refer to them as ocean deserts, they appear so under satellite imagery because the chlorophyll isn't at the surface. In fact, one has production at the bottom of the euphotic layer, so 20 or 30 meters deep. Therefore, the phytoplankton are deeper down, and therefore they might actually be even more affected by the light levels that whether or not they're still able to penetrate the foam at the surface. And thirdly, for all ocean deserts, there are island nations, and there will be amenity and tourist implications for having a lot of foam coming onto the beaches, and that probably is presented by the populations involved.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Good. And I think what you have really tried to do is to begin to create a list of all the consequences of this particular intervention, and indeed lists can be created for all the consequences for all the other interventions as well.
Thank you very much. So the next talk is going to be given, it's listed as, it's going to be given by Jim Fournier, and is that right? That's correct, it's Jim. Well, just a brief lull, I would like to give a huge round of applause to Claire, who's here, come up to Claire, because she's been that Claire has been organising 2 conferences, got another one next week. And so when it came to printing up the delegates list, she was, oh, is this the right one? Anyway, well done. Thank you so much for it. So, Jim, I'm just going to repeat. Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. For many of you, it will be obvious I'm not John Latham. I know a few of you from years ago. I first got into this world through carbon removal. I started a company called Biochar Engineering a number of years ago. Sold that, and living the world, became friends with John Latham. So I'm here to talk about marine cloud lightning. many of the people in this room already know what that is. For the few of you that don't, the basic idea is to make low marine clouds that exist over the ocean surface more reflective by increasing the reflectivity of them by making smaller drops. The idea is that if you have the same volume of water and you have more smaller drops that have a greater surface area and therefore reflect the light. To catalyze the drops, to seed them, we're actually proposing to use sea salt. So the idea is to take ocean water, filter it into a microscopic spray, essentially a fog, and to release that and to catalyze formation to increase the reflectivity of existing clouds. This is a picture of ship tracks which form when ships sail through freighters, and they release sulfur, which can see the formation of these clouds. So it's basically a pollution that's being emitted, and that is known to catalyze the formation of clouds. The real question for marine cloud brightening is, can we do this intentionally in sea salt? And so to do that, we need a technology that produces very fine mist. There's two candidate technologies right now. There's a group in California that's actually produced something that we believe they're testing with. We'll hear about that a bit later. Stephen Salter has also been working on an approach which would produce a uniform size droplet. And the uniform size droplet would be optimal theoretically. If we can get all the droplets the same size, we would have less possibility of them raining out. We'd have optimal properties. We hope that the technology that's going forward is going to give us something good enough to test with, and we can move forward with actually seeing how this works. The studies that I'm going to be presenting today are actually based on work with Ben Parks. He's one of our co-authors. He's using a HADGEN1 model. We're assuming a 3-patch seeding, where we're modeling seeding in 3 regions of the Earth where it's easiest to form clouds. He's using an unusual set of numbers. He's using a 440 part per million control level, and then he's using a pre-industrial doubling to 560 parts per million. So it's a little different than a lot of the studies that have been done looking at doubling with the control being pre-level. So we basically have the control, we have the climate change, and then we have the climate change with MCB. The first thing that we looked at is changing conditions in coral reefs. Again, the study was run at a global level, but in this instance, we're looking at the effect of modeling on very limited regions of the planet. Small areas where you're looking for a change in water temperature and how that impacts the coral. I think this is a particularly interesting and really different application of SRM than anything else we're talking about, because it's directly to benefit ecosystems that are extremely stressed right now and could be done at a scale that is smaller than the scale that would impact the global climate system. So while this modeling study was looking at doing this at a global scale and then looking at the implication in the reefs, the implication is that you could go upstream, essentially, where the water is moving into the reef, and do a small amount of density in that local region and change the water temperature in that reef. Again, the amount of change that we're talking about making in that ship tracking, as you see very noticeable clouds or clouds, what's actually necessary to create the effect that MCB is modeling in its computer studies is below the level that the human eye can discern. You would not be able to look at these clouds and see whether they were bright or not. The next application is a little larger. It's regional as opposed to local. It's a study looking at 7 hurricane basins around the world and proposing to see if we can change the sea surface temperature in the regions where the hurricanes form. And so hurricanes are very complex. It is not clear that sea surface temperature causes hurricanes, but there seems to be a high correlation between elevated sea surface temperatures and formation of hurricanes, and also the amount of power that they dissipate. So in this study, again, we're operating at a global scale in modeling, and then looking at these 7 hurricane basins and looking for a change in the sea surface temperature that we would see in the basin. When we do all of that calculation, it appears that you could get a reduction of at least a category, possibly 2 categories in hurricane strength. I think there's a special caveat with this in that when you're operating at the level of a reef, it's sort of subglobal. If you're operating at the level of the whole global system, presumably one would be choosing to optimize the whole system as well as possible. In this example, it's an example sort of playing favorites. Whose hurricane do you reduce, and what are the effects on the rest of the global system? So while it might be very attractive, I think of all of the implications of MCD, this might actually be the one that has an unintended consequence that people are not yet talking about. So, but it is, again, something that theoretically could be done at a scale less than full global deployment. You could go into a specific basin and work on reducing sea surface temperatures and thereby reducing, theoretically, the power of tropical cyclones, hurricanes that are forming in that region. The third thing we want to talk about is polar sea ice, particularly Arctic sea ice. There have been a series of studies, this one really just follows on previous ones, modeling the effect of doing MCD globally and seeing what happens with sea ice coverage in the Arctic. Many of us are particularly concerned with the Arctic. I got into this, I moved out of carbon removal and into SRM at the point that I recognized that we already are having enough feedback in the Arctic that it itself is already a source of warming. So we're at the point now where it's contributing 0.2 of a watt as of 2011. That's already several years old. The results about to come out are going to show much more loss this year. So, not only are we in a situation where if we stop emitting more CO2, we don't make things better, there are now feedbacks that are actively making things worse, even if we just stop, even if we could stop tomorrow. So, and the other thing with Arctic ice, we model it in certain ways. It's in the climate models. We all treat these climate models as if they're real because it's the sea we swim in. But if we look at the rate of collapse of the Arctic ice versus what was predicted by the models, reality has accelerated much faster than the models predicted, which is sort of a apocryphal lesson on what we could be facing today, where we're pretty sure we know what we're projecting in the future. I think it's fairly safe to say that every time we compare reality with the models, we've seen reality be more difficult than the models. The ice has melted much faster than the models. So one of the interesting things about MCD is that in the natural climate system, you get greater heating at the poles than you get at the equator. Similarly, if you deploy MCD in a model at the equator, it contributes more cooling at the poles than you get at the equator. So the match between where you deploy or where you need heating or cooling and where you get cooling line up fairly well. This is due to the original heat flux, the tendency of heat to move towards the poles. And these results are, an incremental addition to what we've seen before. They show actually on the left, they show MCD actually moving the ice a little further out, the green line, than the control, which is the blue line, and climate change is the red line. So in this particular modeling regime, we see a slight advance of the ice over where it was under the control condition. So I think what all of these things have in common is beginning to think about deployment of ring cloud brightening at a local or regional scale, and also really thinking about what are we facing now and fairly soon. Much of the modeling that's been up to this point has focused on doubling of CO2, partly because the climate models themselves work very well mathematically if you double CO2. I think this may be one of the problems with the accidental press that climate intervention gets, because we talk about a doubling of CO2 so much that it almost seems as if we're validating that that's okay. And we may be very frightened that that's going to happen, but we already have now on the order of only 1.5 watts over pre-industrial. We're seeing severe changes that may be associated with the watt. What would it look like to try and back that much heating out of the system sooner or later? Could we do it with MCD? What's interesting when you start, among other things, when you start looking at that level of intervention rather than the more heroic 4 watts per square meter, is that the amount of seeding you need in terms of surface area is nonlinear. So the first bit of clouds that you see is much more effective than the last bit. So to get 25% as much cooling, you might only need to seed 5 to 15% as much clouds. And if you think about what modeling has shown potential risks in terms of rainfall over tropical regions, or things that's basically the principal thing we're afraid of with MCD, is that we would disrupt rainfall. Well, if you can do 5% as much as was modeled for a doubling of CO2, you're into a regime where the cost-benefit risk starts to look much more attractive to do a little bit and risk very little likelihood of unintended consequences. One would hope, but by doing much less, it would certainly appear you would. This last piece is really a departure from the first three pieces. When you look at modeling the Antarctic, it's very different from the Northern Hemisphere. You can get computer results that show you overcooling the Antarctic, but it's also harder, though, at the levels of seeding that we're seeing in the Northern Hemisphere to show any effect in the Antarctic. So this is another run that was done where it's seeding all of the clouds over the ocean, all available clouds rather than 3 regions. And it extends some work that Phil did where he got similar results, I think, without his aggressive seeding. What was interesting about it is that you get this ring where you get a great deal of cooling, and then at the same time we were looking at this, the results had just come out on the West Antarctic ice sheet. And you can see this diagram A up at the top. And that is, I don't know how to pronounce it right, but the Thwaites Glacier, which is located on the West Antarctic ice shelf, or ice sheet. The West Antarctic ice sheet is worth about 5 meters of ocean rise. And you could kind of think of it as this particular glacier is like a cork in the bottle. The whole of the ice sheet kind of aims down at this glacier. And the glacier sits right here. So it sits in this bay, and it's moving, and it's, in glacial terms, moving fairly rapidly. And you can see that this whole area behind it is lined up to drain down through it. And this summer it was announced that it's pretty much inevitable that it's going to move. They see no way to stop this thing from continuing to move. And what's going on is that the water there's water getting under the glacier, and it's essentially lubricating because there's now warm water moving under the glacier. And that warm water is coming from the global circulation. Once it gets to the Arctic, or the Antarctic, things move this way. There's a very, very strong current that just continuously moves this way. But in near shore, there are these little back currents that move the opposite direction. These are actually glacial melt. And there's been some work done now looking at how warm water is invading this ring, and that warm water is working itself back up under the glacier. The premise that I realized is that in this region, there's a lot of cold water available here, and then there's these little eddies where the melt is actually going on, and then there's warm water getting into this. So it seems plausible, this is the best sort of model we have, the mixing is coming back in this way, but down under here, there's a lot of cold water. That we might be able, this was really proposed as an MCD idea, I don't think it has anything to do with MCD, but it might be plausible to take these pipes that have been proposed for upwelling, either the one proposed by Lovelock and Rapley or the Salter Sink, and essentially do a mechanical intervention where we can bring cold surface water back up under the toe of the glacier and arrest what otherwise is now considered inevitable, long-term, but inevitable collapse of the ocean.
Thank you very much. I was listening to the cricket commentary this morning from Tasmania, and they're talking about these cold Arctic winds coming up. So it's all a bit confusing.
Well, Boston has the same.
Yeah, there we go. Right, so yes, right at the back.
You said that all the model results sort of showed outcomes that were the outcomes were worse than the model results, and I guess I'd like you to defend that or to caution you against strong language. I mean, you know, after all, the climate hasn't warmed so much in the last decade, and you look at the sea ice data, and you can easily just look at this early year fit. It doesn't look that far out as what policy predicted.
Point taken.
Well, that's easy. Okay,
Thank you for a really interesting presentation. I think it suggests a couple of things about the whole geoengineering question. One which has been not focused on terribly is time scale. If you look at the Arctic, the question is, when would society want to arrest trends if possible? And I don't think this is a question of decades out. And just to bring it home a bit, on Monday, we should, in all probability, there'll be an announcement that we've reached the lowest sea ice maximum on record. And I think your statement actually about the models are still trying to catch up with the rate of decline of sea ice. So I think the first thing is it raises the question of how fast would society want options available to it if there were. The second thing is kind of an interesting linkage between your thoughts about managing the Arctic and emission control. Because we now have pretty good estimates, there's a range of emissions from permafrost. Permafrost has 2.5 times the carbon in the atmosphere, and we have estimates of the annual average going forward to the 21st century. So the question for society is, Do we want to let the permafrost go, or do we want to contain it as possible? So I think. Pardon?
Is that the question? This one?
It's a comment.
Oh, okay.
But the question would be, my suggestion is to apply the same sort of analysis to permafrost as well as sea ice.
Is that something you want to respond to?
Well, I think the reason that we're very concerned with sea ice is because it's a marker of how the temperature of that region is doing. And as the ice goes, you have both warming causing the loss of ice and the ice feeding back to create more warming. I'm by no means an expert in how that system works, and I have been cautioned that among the people that are most knowledgeable about methane, for example, there is a sense that from the paleoclimate record, it's previously taken a very long time to come off. I'm also concerned that we're seeing the ice decline very rapidly. So the real truth of the situation, as far as I can see, is that we just don't know. And it's very difficult, from my view, to not have the research funded to prepare these things. You know, we buy fire insurance against much smaller risks than what we're facing. You said what else, right?
One last question before lunch? Lunch. Okay, so we've got the lunchtime perspective session at 1:30 again. Our program is today. If we can really start that nice and promptly, then we can be able to start the afternoon session at 2 o'clock. I think we might be coming up with a solution to Wi-Fi issues. If you're having trouble, then let us know. We had the garden stage, so that